Jacob is this character in the Old Testament, this personality that leads us into a recognition that, sometimes it's really hard to trust his story. Jacob deals with that and lives with that and is in the middle of those things. And today, we pick up our story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because we worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we understand that the deception continues. It's just part and parcel of the story right now. And we find that this deception is insidious, that it creeps in all kinds of different ways. And the bottom line of this is that deception continues and the consequences of the deception accumulate. That's really hard. Because in reality, what I would like is I would like God to take away consequences. I don't want to deal with consequences. I want to have a decision, make a decision, find out that decision is right or wrong. If it's wrong, I'd like to go on from that decision without any consequences. But consequences are accumulating for Jacob, and they accumulate for us as well. Trusting his story is really, really hard. So we pick up our story. We're only going to cover about 55 verses today, folks, so hang on. We're not going to read all of them, but we're going to read some significant ones. So just hang on to your chair because we're going to move at a pretty good clip. We're going to start back in chapter 29. You'll remember that Jacob has been deceived by Laban, and he ends up with 2 wives, plus their servants, and this begins a story that we can't ignore. When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, because remember, Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. And so 1 verse in, we're going to call a timeout because I can't ignore this, all right? I can't ignore this, and we can't ignore this as a body, a household of faith. Infertility is a challenge, and a lot of people really struggle with infertility. We have people in our church. I have people in my sphere of influence who are really struggling with infertility. Some people I really deeply care about. And so I just want to remind you of something, that infertility is not always the woman's fault. I mean, that should seem obvious, but let's just say it out loud to make sure everybody understands that infertility is not always the fault of the woman. That there are natural and genetic reasons that people are infertile, that there's illness that causes infertility, sometimes permanently, that disease and illness can cause infertility, and sometimes only temporarily, but there is a cause from illness. And sometimes infertility is a consequence of previous behavior. Not always. And so you and I are left with this subject, and we have to approach it as followers of Jesus. Even if you are one of those persons that are struggling with this right now, one of those couples that are struggling with this, we have to approach this with this understanding that God speaks into life, with real challenges, with painful troubles, with things that cause great despair in people's lives. We have to trust God and trust His story in the middle of those things. And it's so important for us to recognize that this is a challenge, and it isn't always an easy answer. And sometimes people never find an answer. And sometimes they wait on the Lord, and they wait on the Lord, and they wait on the Lord, and then they start praying for the kind of miracle that Abraham and Sarah had, right? Because hope is lost. You and I have a responsibility to understand that God is still in the middle of those things. God is still in the middle of those things. That we recognize that there's pain that goes with this. And that there can be deep-seated emotional stress in a couple's lives because they're struggling with this. Let's not ignore that reality. You cannot talk about the story of Rachel and Leah and their servants and all that transpires in the next few verses. You cannot talk about it without confronting the reality of infertility. And that's part of the way we live. And we need to make sure that as Jesus followers, we're being compassionate, we're being kind, we're watching our words carefully. I've had couples come to me and tell me, we're not going to be in church for a while because guess what? These people that we really love and that we really like, we really do like them. They just told us that they were pregnant and we're not. We've been trying a whole lot longer than they have, and we just hurt right now. And they said, we just have to stay away for a while because of the pain. I get it. And you ought to get it too. It's part of life. And it's part of the dynamics of living our lives. So, please, if you are struggling with this, whether you're here in person or whether you're watching online, if you're struggling with this and you would like specific prayer for this issue in your lives, would you please contact me? Would you please see me? Because we, and by that I mean at least one other elder, and that would include a woman coming along as well, we want to pray for you. And we want to recognize this dynamic in your lives. And we want to ask God to intervene in a miraculous way. So please, don't ignore it. Don't think it's just going to go away. Don't say this is some kind of punishment from God. Please, ask for us, and we would love to come pray with you and to pray for you. So now we can, get off the rabbit trail that Jim got on, and we can go on. All right, trust the story. The story continues. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. So the wife that Jacob was deceived into taking first is the first one to become pregnant. She gave birth to a son, and she named him Reuben, for she said, "It is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now." Whoa. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? To think somehow that she can buy his love by bearing him a son. That says a lot for the kind of relationship they had. There's a whole bunch in this verse that is in between the lines, so to speak, that really, really causes us concern for this relationship. So, Leah bears 4 sons pretty much right in a row. And the text says that she has Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And these are important characters in the story yet to come. And then the infertility thing creeps in again, because then the text says, then Leah stopped having children. Ooh. In a culture where that was considered the highest form of of service and love and responsibility of a woman, this is a big deal. And when Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, "Give me children or I'll die." Well, this is kind of dramatic, isn't it? This is kind of over the top for her to demand that somehow Jacob can fix things so that she can bear children. And Jacob's response is, "Well, who am I, God, in the middle of this?" And the problem continues to exist of that we struggle with today, that we get deceived into thinking that somehow we need to fix God's problems out for him. That we can come up with some kind of solution to make this work. So what does Rachel do? She sends her servant, Bilhah, in to sleep with her husband Jacob, and Bilhah has 2 sons by Jacob, Dan and Naphtali. She gives him 2 sons. Now, in this culture, I'm not saying this is right, I'm not saying that God approved of this in any way, but in this culture, those were considered Rachel's sons too, because the servant belonged to Rachel. And that's not right. That's not right. Slavery is not right, and claiming the child of a slave for your own is not right. That is not what God intends for us to do. Please, don't read into this text that somehow God approves of all this. This is a real story about real people, including all their flaws and all their faults. Because God does not need us to figure out how to accomplish his will. He doesn't. So the text goes on, when Leah saw that she had stopped having children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife to sleep with. That's what you ought to read. And so then Jacob has 2 sons with Zilpah, the servant girl of Leah, and those sons are Gad and Asher. And again, I want to remind you, this is Leah stepping into a place of responsibility that she shouldn't be in. It's not up to us to do this, because God does not need us to figure out how to accomplish his will. Later on in the story, they're harvesting wheat. And, they didn't have combines. John Deere hadn't come along yet. They didn't have combines. So when you went out to harvest wheat, this was all done by hand. It was extraordinarily labor intensive. And during this wheat harvest, Reuben, the oldest of all the sons, right? This is the firstborn to Leah. Reuben went out into the fields and he found some mandrake plants, which he brought to his mother Leah. Now, you are going, mandrake plants? What does that have to do with anything? All right, mandrakes were and are considered an aphrodisiac. If you don't know what that word means, it means there was some kind of sexual stimulating power that they thought these plants had in a person. And so Reuben brings these mandrake plants, the fruit and the plant and the flower, back to his mother, and to his mother Leah. And then Rachel says to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." Rachel's still childless. Remember? The only thing that has happened is that Rachel gave her servant Bilhah to Jacob, and she had 2 sons, and Rachel's claiming those for her own, but she still bears the shame in her culture and in her own mind of not having borne any children on her own. So she's looking for some kind of solution. Man, God just doesn't need us to find the solutions for him. But this is what Leah said to Rachel. "Wasn't it enough that you took away my husband?" Who got married first? Leah and Jacob. Rachel marries him a week later, 1 week later. And Jacob loves Rachel more than Leah. And she says to her, wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Are you also going to take away my son's mandrakes? And then Rachel does something that is almost evil. Maybe I'm being harsh in labeling it evil, but it's evil. Very well, says Rachel. He can sleep, that is Jacob, can sleep with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes. She's going to, what is this, sell her husband to Leah or rent him? Or what exactly, what does this look like? This is just pure evil. Pure evil. So when Jacob came in from the fields that evening, Leah went out to meet him, and she says, you have to sleep with me tonight because I have hired you. She uses this employee-employer language. I've hired you with my son's mandrakes. So Joseph slept with her that night. Remind you again, God does not need us to figure out how to accomplish his will. So let's face this reality. He stays with Leah for a while because Leah becomes pregnant, not once, but twice, and bears 2 more sons. Here is the list of the sons that Jacob ended up having with Leah, not with Leah and her servant, Zilpah, but with Leah herself. There's Reuben and Simeon and Levi and Judah. They were born first, and then she's unable to conceive for a while, and now Issachar and Zebulun are born to this relationship. Wow, 6 sons of Jacob from Leah. Sometime, the text says, sometime later, she, Leah, gave birth to a daughter and named her Dinah. Now, this is important, and I included this morning. It's in the text, and it's important because it's there, but it's important for us to recognize something. A little bit of a rabbit trail, but highly related, okay? This is the first mention of a girl being born who's given a name in the book of Genesis. This is the first time. This is God already moving and working to elevate the position of women in the culture in which they were suppressed and in which they were regarded as property. That was already happening in Jacob's day. And this is God just recognizing that she was named and getting Moses to include this in the story is amazing. And it ought to stop you and help you realize that God is really concerned about the place of the image bearers which he has created who happen to be women. He's really concerned because this name is mentioned, spelled out, specified in the text. That's really, really important. And then the text goes, then God remembered Rachel, and he enabled her to conceive. Can you imagine the elation that Rachel experienced when she found out she was pregnant? Can you imagine? I mean, this was years of infertility, and now she is finally pregnant. And there was a lot of shame that went with not having children in that culture. And it was wrong, but it was there. Sometimes Scripture tells us things that aren't right, but they're reality. And this is one of those things. It's not right for her to experience that shame, but it is her reality. And what an amazing miracle from God. You struggle with infertility? Let's pray for a miracle, because miracles really do happen. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, God has taken away my disgrace. And she named him Joseph. Yeah, the same Joseph who went to Egypt and sold into slavery and said, may the Lord add to me another son. Can I just remind you of something? Who is Jacob's favorite wife? Rachel. Who is Rachel's firstborn son? Joseph. Who is Jacob's favorite son? Joseph. And boy, that gets him in a lot of trouble in the story of Joseph, doesn't it? Because his brothers end up selling him into slavery to get that obnoxious little snot-nosed kid out of their lives. Because they don't want him around. He's daddy's favorite. Let's get rid of him. So just as a review, let's go through all the sons of Jacob. Because now we have 11 and really we're going to mention number 12. The sons of Jacob. From Leah, he had Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. From Leah's servant, he had Gad and Asher. From Bilhah, the servant of Rachel, he had Dan and Naphtali. And from Rachel, he gets Joseph, and later on, not in this chapter, but later on in the story, gets Benjamin, the youngest. And by the way, just so you know the complete picture here, she dies in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. And it wrecks Jacob's life. And we will see that later on in this story. Can I just point out again, this is so important in this part of Jacob's story. God does not need you and me to figure out how to accomplish his will. Look at the mess that's created. All this conflict between these two sisters. They should have loved each other. They should have been helping each other. They should have been supporting one another during their childbearing years and raising these kids. They should have been working together, cooperating together, loving each other in such a way that their sons and their daughter Dinah knew what it was to be loved and cared for. Instead, everybody played favorites. Everybody had their little spheres of power, and they all lived in continual conflict with each other. It's disastrous. And it's what happens when you and I step in and we try to figure out how God is going to accomplish what he wants to accomplish. We don't need to do it. We need to trust his story. And what happens now is all of a sudden, Jacob has 4 women that he's been sleeping with who've borne him 11 children at this point in the story, 11 sons plus a daughter. He has all these kids, and he goes to his father-in-law, Laban, and he says, okay, I got this huge family to support. You need to start paying me for all your work, for all the work I give to you. And so Jacob and Laban end up negotiating. And it's quite a negotiation because, in that day and in that time, there wasn't a dollar bill. There wasn't a coin. There wasn't paper money. You couldn't write a check on a bank account. Everything was measured in the number of animals you owned, in the number of fields you had to harvest from, in the number of wives and children you had, in the number of slaves that you owned. All these factored in to wealth and money and power. And Jacob goes to Laban and says, I got to do something. I have all this responsibility now, but I'm totally dependent on you, which should not have happened, folks. That should not have happened. Once again, Jacob is facing consequences because of decisions that were made that were not right. It's reality, but it wasn't right. And I just want to point out again, and if you think I'm harping on something, that's good, because I am. All right? You need to recognize that in the Bible, we have stories that would not exist if it were not for the direction of the Holy Spirit. Because I guarantee that if you were writing the story of Jacob, and if you wanted people to honor the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you wouldn't put stuff like this in the story. You just wouldn't. You'd leave this out. It would be convenient to leave all this out. It would make Jacob seem more like a hero to leave all this out. But the Bible deals with real people in real life situations. And the stories we have recorded for us are there to help us recognize that there is no expectation on the part of God for you or me to live a perfect life, but He calls us to live a real life. And when He calls us to live a holy life, He means that we have a clean account with Him today, that we've confessed the sin that He's revealed to us, that we've repented of that sin and turned away from it, and that we have a right standing before Him, another way of saying that we're righteous. So, Laban and Jacob, they're in this negotiation, and Jacob is the one who's taking the lead. And he says this, any goat in my possession that is not speckled or spotted, or any lamb that is not dark colored, will be considered stolen. In other words, Laban, if there are lambs that aren't speckled, or lambs that aren't dark colored, or goats that aren't speckled or spotted, they're yours. They're yours. I only want the ones, and really here, Jacob is saying, I'll take the ones of lesser quality. It shouldn't be lost on us. I think God has a sense of humor here. And I think Moses definitely had a sense of humor as he recorded this under God's direction. The name Laban in Hebrew literally means white. And Joseph is saying, you get all the white ones. Jacob is saying, you get all the white ones, Laban. I'll take the ones that are spotted, blemished, the black sheep, etc. And Laban says, agreed. This is easy. Let it be as you have said. But Laban goes on deceiving, because that same day, he removes all the females from his flocks that bear those marks. Because the deal with Joseph was any lambs that are born spotted or streaked or black, any of those animals that are born that way, they become Jacob's as his wages. And Laban removes all those females from his flocks, all the males from his flocks. He sends them away with his sons, and he sends his sons a 3-day journey away. Gets them as far away as they can. No way those animals are going to mate, in other words. And yeah, let's just skip. And all the speckled or spotted female goats, all that had white on them, and all the dark colored animals, Laban, next slide, Laban placed them in the care of his 2 sons, and he sent his sons 3 days' journey away. The deception continues. It's horrific. Now, in the process of doing this, you and I say, boy, this story is so messed up. There are so many things wrong with the story. What does God really want me to get from this story? And if I can use this illustration with you, and you're patient and you bear with some blurry photos for a minute, it's as if we are looking at the backside of a tapestry. The backside of a tapestry is full of all kinds of loose threads and knots and a mess. It doesn't even make sense. It looks like somebody wadded up a bunch of loose threads and threw them. And then somebody took a picture of it against a blue backdrop. That's what it looks like. And sometimes that's the only thing that you and I can see about life, is that it's all messed up. That it's a knotted mess. But the flip side of this tapestry is what God is always focused on, because the flip side is actually something pretty beautiful. But we get so focused on the mess that we fail to recognize, from God's perspective, there's something really unique and special taking place here. And that's what's happening. Because the way this all transpired, with all the deception and all the lies and all the stuff because Joseph is the one who bears a lot of the responsibility later on for his whole family, right? He rescues his family from starvation, and he brings them to Egypt, and they come live with him, and all this continues under Joseph. But Jacob just contributes to the mess because now he's going to call into question how he accumulates wealth. Because Jacob goes through this thing, and it's recorded for you in the text. You ought to go read chapter 30 in the book of Genesis. It's an amazing story, and I just can't understand why people don't read it more often, because it's better than any script written for a soap opera, I'll tell you that. Because Jacob, he devises this plan, and he strips bark off some branches, and when the animals were in heat, he would take these branches out and put them near the water they were drinking, and by that, he tried to ensure that, there were speckled and spotted goats born, and that there were black sheep born, and he was trying to manage all this. And the text actually says, in this way, the man, Joseph, grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. In other words, he got rich. He got rich. But I just want you to know that there was nothing about those branches or the way he brought them to the water. It was nothing at all. I mean, there have been people who have tried to figure this out and say, oh, God intended for this to happen. No, God intended for the story to be told, but the story points to the miraculous power of God, not to some kind of genetic alteration on the part of Jacob. Because that's beyond Jacob. That's just beyond his ability to do anything about. And this part of the story reminds me of a story that I read when I was a teenager. It comes out of a time that most of you can't even relate to. But at one time in the history of the church, overarching church around the world, there were people who filled cars and suitcases and smuggled Bibles into other parts of the world. There was a time when that was done regularly. And I remember reading a book as a teenager called God's Smuggler, written by Brother Andrew. They didn't even put his last name on there because they didn't want to attract undue attention to him at that point. And Brother Andrew, in his book God's Smuggler, tells a story about pulling up to a border crossing into Romania where Bibles were not allowed. And he's driving a Volkswagen Bug, and he's got it packed with Bibles that are hidden. And he pulls up to the border crossing, and he watches the car in front of him literally get dismantled by the border guards. I mean, they're taking door panels off. They're ripping the headliner off the ceiling of this car in front of him. They're even taking parts of the engine out of the engine compartment. They spend hours taking apart this car. And he's watching this happening. And he's got a automobile full of Bibles. And he says, God, what am I going to do? And it comes to him. I believe the Holy Spirit gives him direction. It comes to him. And he says, okay, God, if I'm going to get caught, I'm going to get caught out in the open and not hiding something. And he is able, while he's sitting in his car, to dig quite a few Bibles out of hiding. And he puts them on the seats of this Volkswagen, the front seat and the back seat, so that they're easily visible to the border guards. And he says, God, if I'm going to get through this, it's going to be you, not me. And he drives up, when the car in front of him moves, he drives up. He hands his passport and his visa papers through the window to the guard. The guard looks at him, looks at his photo on his passport, scribbles something on his visa, and Brother Andrew is starting to open the door, but he realizes that the guard actually is standing so close to the door that he can't even get out of the Volkswagen. And within 30 seconds, the guard waves him on. He doesn't take anything apart. He doesn't search the car. He doesn't go through it at all. This is the same kind of thing that happens with Joseph. There's no question that God worked a miracle to get Brother Andrew across that border that day. And there's no question at all that it was God who worked the miracle of making Jacob prosperous. Because there's nothing that Jacob could have done to breed flocks, huge flocks of speckled and spotted goats and of black sheep. Nothing he could have done. It's got to be God. And we have this story, we have this account to remind us that we really can trust his story. You can trust his story. Because God is at work. God is doing these things. And sometimes the tapestry to us looks messy and complicated and is discouraging and is depressing. And we deal with infertility and disease and accidents and unexplained phenomena in our lives. And we say, God, can you answer this? Would you please help me see how this all fits together? But we're looking at the backside of that tapestry. And God is making something beautiful on the other side. That's why Jesus says in Matthew 16, he says, if you want to come after me, if you want to follow me, you have to take up your cross and follow me. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be fulfilling. It's going to be full of contentment. If we follow Jesus, if we follow him, he's going to show us how to deal with the everyday things of life. He's not going to take them all away. He's going to show us how to live with them because he walks with us through the pain. Walks with us through death. He walks with us through the teacher who gave us a grade that we didn't deserve. He walks with us through the boss who treated us unfairly. He walks with us through life. He doesn't take all the bad things of life away. He walks with us. He was with Jacob. And often Jacob didn't even see it. And he tried to figure out things on his own. And his wives and their servants certainly tried to figure out things on their own. And Laban was as deceptive as Jacob was. And we have all this conflict and all this mess presented to us, but it ends with the story of Jacob's flocks increasing exponentially in ways that we can't even understand or explain, except by the fact that God is at work. God is at work. Can you trust God at work in your life? Can you trust him at work in your life right now? Can you see God working through relationships and circumstances and situations and the pain and the frustration and the depression and the anxiety and the paranoia, all that goes along with living in this life? Can you see him at work? And can you trust his story? Or do you keep trying to take the story back for yourself? Are you trying to write the end of your own story, or are you letting God write the end of your story? Are you letting God write how today goes, or are you trying to figure it out on your own? Our challenge, my challenge, your challenge is to trust the story because, well, God is at work. He really is. He's doing amazing things all around us. And unfortunately, we get so blinded by our own troubles and our own pain and our own expectations that we often fail to see what God is doing because he's at work. Would you look around you today and see what he's doing? Would you do your best to ignore the messy side of the tapestry and trust him for what it's going to turn out when he flips it over? Can you? Will you? This is our challenge. This is our lesson today from the life of Jacob.